Over 21,000 men, women, and children were taken from Norfolk, Virginia to the New Orleans slave market between 1800 and 1860. Their destination was the New Orleans slave market, the largest human trafficking site in the country, where thousands of people were purchased to work the cotton plantations in the Mississippi River Valley. Norfolk's slave trade business was centered on Main Street, where wealthy slave traders had offices and slave jails. And while some commerce occurred in their offices and at the site of the slave jails, the region's main slave market was located at the intersection of Main and Commerce Streets. Unlike Norfolk, the New Orleans slave market was the entire city. Enslaved people were sold everywhere, with auction blocks located at the St. Louis Hotel, private residences, public parks, coffee houses, slave pens, commercial complexes such as the Banks Arcade, and aboard the decks of ships moored in the New Orleans slave port. The trafficking and exploitation of hundreds of thousands of human beings allowed slave traders, hoteliers, bankers, auctioneers, brokers, insurance companies, and merchants to prosper in this multi-billion-dollar industry. As such, Norfolk's robust contribution to the domestic slave trade that shipped thousands of people to work on the cotton plantations in the Lower South reflected how America's first and most important big business separated families, enriched individuals, businesses, and industries, and traumatized generations of people whose lives were forever changed in the worst form of human exploitation that operated openly and with the full support of the national government in modern history. Hello, I'm Cassandra Newby Alexander, the endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture and the moderator for today's segment entitled Virginia's People, Sold Down River. I'm excited to host this discussion with my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Richmond, professor of history here at Norfolk State University, and her team of researchers who are working on this important Sold Down River project that seeks to uncover the names, the fates, and the descendants of thousands of people who left from the Norfolk port and arrived in New Orleans before America's Civil War.
Maddie?
This podcast program is part of a series presented by Norfolk State University's Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies, WNSB, the City of Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs, and the Virginia Beach History Museums. This episode is the first of 3 important discussions we will have this year discussing labor challenges faced by African Americans here in Hampton Roads and beyond. So let's get started with today's discussion.
So Dr. Stephanie Richmond is the one who spearheaded this important study on the domestic slave trade between Norfolk and New Orleans for the past 4 years. So I'd like to talk a little bit with my colleague, Dr. Richmond, to really uncover some of the background of this project and the challenges that you faced. So how is this project, Dr. Richmond, relevant to today's society?
So much of what we know about the economic history of the United States really glosses over or ignores the origins of the modern capitalist society and our modern economy in the slave trade. In public schools and even in college, there's a lot of emphasis placed on the transatlantic slave trade, but really most of the African Americans in the United States today did not get brought directly from Africa. Their ancestors did not get brought directly from Africa to what would become the United States. Instead, they were kind of routed through Central and South America. But almost every African American in the U.S. today has ancestors who were part of the domestic slave trade. Once the transatlantic slave trade closed in 1808, or closed legally in 1808, the domestic slave trade, the trade of people from one state to another, picked up pace. And this had a lot to do with economic and environmental changes in the Upper South, as well as Western expansion, particularly the Louisiana Purchase. And so as we've been studying and trying to trace the 20,000+ people who were taken from Virginia and sold into New Orleans, we have really begun to uncover the roots of the modern capitalist economy. So many banks and insurance companies, very wealthy families, both in New Orleans and here in Virginia, got their start and made their money buying and selling people. And this is a really important thing for us to understand as a nation today as we struggle with the economic realities of the 21st century and the ways in which the racial wealth gap has continued to expand as we move into the 21st century.
Some of the things that you were talking about, it made me think about how there are so much discussion even today about how those who have been slaveholders lost everything at the end of the Civil War. But what you're finding out is that so many people actually sold their enslaved property prior to the Civil War. And so they came off with a lot of money prior to that war. And even those who had to had to free their enslaved people at the end of the war, they still didn't lose everything. In fact, what are some of the things that you found out about those who did have plantations in the Lower South during the Civil War? Did any of them leave the country and take their enslaved people with them?
So certainly there was an increase in the domestic slave trade in the years immediately leading up to the American Civil War. So starting in 1860, we see the pace picking up dramatically in the number of people who are being sold. And then during the war itself, there was a lot of buying and selling of enslaved people, especially as the war front advanced through the Upper South and into the Deep South. New Orleans is kind of a unusual city in the South during the Civil War because they capitulated pretty quickly to the Union. And so in 1863, right, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect in Louisiana and particularly in New Orleans. So the domestic slave trade pretty much grinds to a halt there in early 1863. But the 1850s and into the first years of the 1860s, the domestic slave trade in Louisiana continued. And one of the things we have really begun to uncover is really more about what is happening in the Upper South, is that the peak of the domestic slave trade leaving Virginia is in the 1830s and then continuing into the 1840s. The earliest records we've uncovered to date start in 1807. So even before the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, we were seeing slave traders coming into the Upper South, or really coming from the Upper South, leaving out of Norfolk with ships full of enslaved people, taking them to New Orleans. And so this only picks up pace after 1808. And then accelerates even more rapidly in the early 1820s as land in the Mississippi River Valley is opened to new plantations and new settlement.
And so this project really only looks at New Orleans because enslaved people, even from the Norfolk port, were being sent to what other slave ports in the South?
So New Orleans is the largest one, and it's the easiest one to research because the way Louisiana kept its records. But enslaved people from Virginia were also being sold in Savannah, Georgia, and particularly in Mobile, Alabama. There's a lot of crossover between the Alabama slave trade and the Louisiana slave trade, obviously, since they're right next door to each other. And so we do actually get some records in the New Orleans notary records, which are our main source of evidence for this project, that talk about sales that happened in Mississippi and Alabama because Louisiana residents would actually cross the state border into the neighboring states to purchase enslaved people who were not able to be sold in Louisiana because of Louisiana's laws. Louisiana did not allow children under the age of 8 to be sold away from their parents. And also, if you could not guarantee that an enslaved person was not prone to running away or alcohol wasn't an alcoholic or didn't have a medical issue, it was very hard to sell people in Louisiana without all these strictures. And so they'd go across the border into neighboring states without all those rules and then record the sale when they came back into the state of Louisiana.
I was just wondering if you could give us a brief overview of the communities in Virginia and Louisiana and why the slave traders sent them specifically to the New Orleans slave market, because as you said, that was the largest one of all of them. I mean, if you're including Charleston and Savannah and those other areas that, had a robust market, what was it about New Orleans that was so important?
So there are a couple of reasons why enslaved people were being sold from Virginia, and particularly from the greater Hampton Roads region. And most of this has to do with the fact that when the tobacco market collapsed for a variety of reasons, right around and shortly after 1800, there were more enslaved people in southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina than were really needed to grow the new crops that were being introduced. Southeastern Virginia, northeastern North Carolina switched over to truck farming right around the turn of the 19th century. And truck farming is growing produce, silage for animals, so corn, wheat, vegetables, and they experimented with a number of other crops in the region, lots of timber farming, growing pine stands for pitch and naval stores. And those crops are just not as labor intensive per acre as tobacco was. And so there were more enslaved people than were needed to do the work. Also, the collapse of the tobacco market and the exhaustion of the soil meant that for many slaveholders in southeastern Virginia, the enslaved people were the most valuable thing they owned. And so in order for them to make money, they sold particularly young enslaved people. And so the kind of average person that we have traced in here is a young person, both men and women, in their late teens or early 20s, because they were the most valuable for doing agricultural labor. And so there's a less demand for labor, there's a real demand for capital, for money. And New Orleans has the opposite problem, right? New Orleans is the gateway to the Mississippi River Valley, which had recently been opened after the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 and Louisiana's introduction as a state, and cotton. And also sugarcane, which grows in the coastal parishes in Louisiana, are extraordinarily labor intensive. And there were more and more acres of land being put under agricultural production in the Gulf Coast than anywhere else in the United States in the time period that we're looking at. And so there's a seriously high demand for more enslaved people in this area. Also, because cotton and sugar grow best in pretty wet soil, there are also a lot of diseases, right, circulating in the coastal region in the Gulf. And so there's a lot of turnover. People don't live that long. And so we have both high demand because of expansion, but also high demand because the death rates, particularly of newly imported enslaved people into the Gulf Coast region, are quite high due to mosquito-borne illnesses and accidents.
And of course, what makes that even worse were the physicians, the white physicians, who popularized this belief that black people were born sick, and therefore they didn't need to treat them for a whole host of illnesses. So it's amazing that they actually survived.
It is amazing. We have uncovered quite a few stories, which you can find on our Sold Down River website, which is solddownriver.com. And we'll have some more podcast and audiovisual material coming out later this year that trace some of the people who did manage to not only survive, but to start new families and to make amazing contributions to the communities they joined in Louisiana and the Mississippi River Valley more widely throughout this time period.
So just to give perspective to our modern audience, what would an individual who was, say, in their prime, 20, 25 years old, what would they, if they're a male and then a female, what would they be worth in the slave market? And how would that translate to today's dollars?
So the prices, they're going to vary over time because we're also talking about half a century or longer here. But kind of on average in the 1830s, the average price we're seeing for someone between the ages of 16 and 24 is between $550 and $1,000. And that is upwards of close to $40,000 or more in today's money. At one point, I'm blanking on my exact dates, but I think it's like 1840 because inflation was quite high due to the 1837 financial crisis. $1,000 is about $60,000 today. So even someone who owned only 2 or 3 enslaved people, that's the equivalent of being able to purchase 2 or 3 very high end, really nice cars today, right? Or to own a nice suburban house. And usually most of those individuals also owned property as well, land and houses.
So you're talking about the exchange of a lot of money, and those who were owners were able to be catapulted generationally into the middle and upper middle class and even the wealthier category. There's more to come with this discussion,